Hello, my name is Lizzie Kennedy and I'm the current coordinator at the Community Writing Center and would like to thank you for viewing our virtual workshop on the basics of grant writing. Here at the Community Writing Center, we serve the Great Lakes Bay region through one-on-one consultations and writing workshops, all free of charge. The purpose of this workshop is to help you learn the basics of writing an effective and impactful grant application, and the audience is any person preparing to apply for a grant. This could include individuals, organizations, or even small businesses. The only materials you'll need for this workshop will be note-taking materials like a paper and pencil, and the workshop handout found on our website that will help you follow along during the drafting portion of this workshop. All of our workshops here at the Community Writing Center aim to firstly create an inclusive, respectful, and productive environment for all writers, and we also seek to provide feedback, strategies, and resources that writers need to improve their writing. We also encourage collaboration between writers through active conversation and participation. To begin, let's discuss the very basics of what a grant is and what they can be used for. Grants themselves are monetary amounts allocated by individuals or corporations to fund specific projects or initiatives. Grant funding is technically free money that you do not have to repay over time. A grant application is a written argument that a problem exists and that, with the use of the requested funding, you or your organization can help solve that problem. There are many levels of grant funders, such as community foundations, state or federal grants, or national corporations. Local grants are typically much easier to access compared to larger funding agencies. The crucial part about writing a grant application is understanding what the grant will and will not fund. While each funding agency may have different qualifications or guidelines for what types of things they might fund, grants are most commonly used for projects or initiatives that meet a specific need or address a specific problem. This means that you typically cannot seek grant funding for overall operating costs. For example, a grant would not help you fund a startup company from the ground up, but a grant might help you fund a community book drive because it is a very specific project with clear outcomes. There can be many challenges associated with writing a grant. It can be difficult to put into words the ideas that you have in your mind and describe them accurately to a reader. We often feel passionate about our organizations and our causes, and it can be challenging to convince an outside reader that our projects deserve funding. Because of this, it can be difficult to find a grant that fits the scope of your work and your project. Additionally, grants have several sections, and as a grant writer, it can be challenging to make sure that every section is completed fully and accurately. Because others might not be as familiar with your project as you are, it's crucial to make your application both effective and relevant. There are a few tips to keep in mind when planning to write your grant. Firstly, be sure to read the grant guidelines very carefully. Some grants require you to have a 503(c) status or require your organization to be part of a specific region. The guidelines, usually found on the agency's website, will help inform you on whether your project even fits the standards of the grant agency. It can also be helpful to research the projects that the grant agency has funded in the past and see if your project is similar. Next, always review the grant application in depth. Funding agencies typically have very specific missions and goals and fund projects or initiatives that support similar goals. For example, the Saginaw Community Foundation funds projects that directly benefit the Saginaw community, and therefore an application should touch on why a project could positively impact Saginaw. It's sometimes helpful to look at the language used in the funder's mission statement itself and replicate that same language in your application to support your argument that your goals align with theirs. Additionally, reading the grant application thoroughly will alert you to various requirements such as word count limits, deadlines, financial statements you'll need to provide, or letters of support you have to include. A good tip is also to call the grant funder and speak directly with someone who understands the mission and requirements of the agency. They will often be able to offer input or suggestions about how to approach your grant application and may even be able to tell you right away if your project doesn't match the goals of the funding agent. Sometimes the person you speak to could even offer to review your grant prior to submission. It's a good idea to take advantage of these opportunities to make your application as successful as possible. You'll also want to create a drafting timeline to complete your grant. It's a good idea to plan on finishing the application at least a week before it's officially due to avoid last-minute stress, technology issues, etc. Break up all the tasks you need to do, such as requesting letters of support or solidifying your budget, and set dates in stone to keep yourself on track. Lastly, plan to have your grant looked over by at least 2 other people. A second and third set of eyes will always help you pick up on areas that need further improvement. It's sometimes helpful to have someone within your organization view your application to make sure it represents your missions and values accurately, and also someone from outside your organization so that you can get feedback on how your grant looks to an outside viewer. It's important to keep in mind that the group reviewing your application is going out of their way to review your application and consider funding your project. Putting effort into making sure your application is thorough and well executed is a sign of respect to those reviewing it. This slide shows you a list of 8 questions that you must be able to answer prior to writing a grant application. What is the project you want to do? What is the need for this project and how will the project address this need? What are the goals of this project? Who will be doing this project? How will you know if the project was effective? When will the project start and finish? What are your plans for continuing this project? And lastly, how much will the project cost? We're going to pause here in the workshop to do a quick drafting session. If you have a project in mind that you're looking to receive funding for, or even just a rough idea of something you would like to plan someday, take this time to draft quick answers to these 8 questions. I recommend pausing the workshop here and writing for a full 10 to 15 minutes before continuing on with the rest of the workshop. The reason I had you answer those 8 questions is because those correspond to the 8 sections found on almost every grant application: the executive summary, statement of purpose, project impact or outcomes, qualifications and collaborations, assessment, timeline, future plans, and budget. While these sections might vary by name based on the grant you're applying for, nearly every grant application will require you to be able to speak on these 8 topics. To tackle these sections, it's sometimes helpful to start with overviews. Make sure you fully understand why your project is important, how it helps your mission, and what its intended goals are before jumping into detailed sections like the budget or timeline. I'm now going to talk you through each of these sections and give you some tips on how you can develop each of them. The executive summary answers the question, what is the project that you want to do, and is the elevator pitch of your grant where you introduce the topic and give an overview of all its working parts. You should elaborate here on who, what, why, where, when, and how your project will function. This is often the part that gets read before the rest of the application, so it's important to make a good first impression here. This section is typically around 750 words, and it's helpful to write this portion last after you have confidently written out the rest of your application. Your statement of purpose makes the argument that a problem or need exists and that you can provide a project to address that problem or need. The first section should explain the problem using current data, such as from the U.S. Census or the U.S. Department of Education. This problem must be a problem that the grantor has indicated they want to address. So if they say they want to help children living in poverty, you should find data that demonstrates how many of your children live in poverty in your service area, or the number of students who qualify for free or reduced lunches. The second section should show how your project helps to address that problem and how your organization is specifically positioned to provide the solution. Let's say your agency wants to provide programming for veterans. What is your history of working with veterans? Is this part of your mission? Is this part of your service population? Or are you partnering with another organization who works closely with veterans? Your statement of purpose typically ends up being your longest section because you must demonstrate your argument using facts and statistics. It's helpful to show that you've done your research and can not only say that a need exists, but that you can prove it with statistical data. This section should describe 2 to 3 goals or intended outcomes you have for your particular project. Make sure that these goals are both realistic and doable. You probably won't be able to solve the issue of systemic racism or high illiteracy rates, but your project could begin to address these issues. Grant money is given to you in good faith that you can achieve these goals, so you must be able to prove that you can achieve these outcomes. You should discuss both quantitative and qualitative data in this section. For example, if you are seeking funding for a Habitat for Humanity build, you can set a quantitative goal of building 5 houses and using 30 volunteers in order to serve 5 families. You can also use qualitative data or soft data to suggest that you did make an impact, such as making people feel more safe or secure in their homes. Make sure you don't overpromise here. Your goals should be attainable, and by sticking to these goals, you will be more likely to stay on track with your project overall. In this section, you should tell your reader more detail about you or your organization's specific mission, history, and experience addressing the need you outlined in your statement of purpose. The purpose of this is to show to the Grant Review Committee that you and your organization are positioned to implement your project. This can be done by creating a list of the individuals who will be fulfilling various roles in the implementation of your project and describing their past experience or specific qualifications for working on the project. It's also a good idea to consider collaborations that you could speak on. Grant funders like to see multiple organizations or nonprofits working together to implement a joint program or support a shared goal. This shows them that their funding would have a broader reach by supporting multiple organizations and having a larger community scope. The assessment section of your grant application should show the funding committee how you plan to evaluate the efficacy of your project or initiative. This is another area where you should touch on both quantitative and qualitative means of assessment. It's much easier to measure efficacy quantitatively, such as tracking the number of participants, measuring how many people were served, etc. Qualitative means of assessment should measure overall project impact, such as through the use of open-ended survey questions, asking participants to rate their perception of the project on a Likert scale, or conducting a focus group to receive direct feedback. Overall, your means of assessment should describe to your grant funder how you plan to evaluate how effectively you met the goals you outlined in your project outcomes section. Just as you have to be thoughtful and realistic in your goals, you should also be realistic in your means of assessment. You might not be able to track participant data, but perhaps you can track numbers of social media likes or numbers of views on videos. Don't be afraid to be creative about your means of assessment. Your timeline section should show a grant funder exactly how long your project will take and how it can be broken down month by month. It's sometimes helpful to think of this section as a to-do list with all of the various tasks or milestones you will include during the implementation of your project or initiative. You should always be keeping in mind the funding cycle. The application is due at a specific time, and you cannot start using funding until it is allocated to you. So any part of your timeline that requires funding should start after the time of allocation. However, it's important to build in time for planning because there are likely multiple tasks you have to implement prior to the initial start of a project. It's easiest to present this information in a chart or monthly timetable, and remember to give yourself time not only to receive the allocation, but also to write the final grant report. Also, your descriptions of the tasks or milestones should be brief because you describe the rest of your project in detail throughout the rest of the application. Focus only on what things will happen and who will be doing which task. The Future Plans section of your grant application lets a grant funder know how you plan to continue your project after the funding is used up, if applicable. Not all grants ask this, but many community foundations and state grants want to see your long-term plan. This might be where you identify potential funding sources outside of the grant that you're applying for that might be able to support your long-term project in the future. Because they can't fund you forever, they sometimes like to fund pilot projects that you plan to sustain over time through a variety of funding sources. Overall, think of this section as answering the question, what will you do after funding is used up? The final section of your grant should be the budget for your project, and you should include the cost breakdown of every cost associated with implementing your initiative. You should firstly show how exactly the grant funding will be used, then describe how you or your organization will provide internal funding, and finally describe your plans if you receive no funding or only partial funding. When speaking on your own internal funding, it's usually required that you match the amount that you are requesting from the funding agent. You can do this in several ways. Perhaps a library has donated space for you to host a program, but they usually rent that room out for $50 an hour. You can include that $50 per hour cost as an in-kind donation from the library that contributes to your internal funding. Also, if you have any salaried employees or outside professionals who are donating their time to help with the project, you can include an hourly breakdown of their salary as part of your own internal funding. Most grants require a 100% match from your organization, so make sure you are breaking down all of your costs and expenses to match the amount you're requesting from the funding agent. A quick note is that while you very well may be utilizing volunteers for your project, they are not included in your matched internal funding because they would not normally be compensated per hour. It's also important to plan how you will continue with your project if you aren't given any funding or only given partial funding. You want to showcase your dedication to the project with or without the grant funder's allocation, so you should have an alternative in mind, such as seeking funding elsewhere or scaling down your project to make it more affordable. Your budget information should be presented on a spreadsheet or in a table, and make sure to double-check your numbers several times. A funding agent will be looking carefully at your financial information, and you want to make sure that this information is entirely accurate. Check and double-check your numbers here. Now that we've briefly gone over the 8 basic grant sections, let's talk through some general tips for drafting the grant itself. Firstly, use clear language and short sentences. The Grant Review Committee is reviewing many applications, and it's helpful to make your information as clear and concise as possible. You should also always consider your audience. As mentioned before, your reader may not be familiar with your organization, your mission, or the issue you're advocating for. Don't assume that your audience will understand acronyms or facts that you as the writer might think are commonplace. As another way to keep your grant concise, use bullet points and numbered lists when appropriate. This helps you stay within the word count while also organizing your information in a way that is much more readable than huge blocks of text. Along those same lines, be very conscious of word counts. Do not exceed the limitations given by the grant funder, especially because an online application might cut you off once you have hit that limit, and you could lose valuable information to support your application. Lastly, use future tense with your verbs as if you have already received the funding you're seeking. Say "we will do this" instead of "we plan to do this." This shows confidence in the efficacy of your program. I'd like to thank you again for viewing this virtual workshop on the basics of grant writing. The Community Writing Center regularly hosts a more advanced grant writing workshop, and I encourage you to keep an eye on our website, communitywritingcenter.com, for more information about accessing that workshop and viewing a successful grant application. As a reminder, we are always available for one-on-one writing consultations on any writing piece. Our consultants would be more than happy to look at a grant application you're working on and offer you feedback prior to submission. If you have any follow-up questions about this workshop or the Community Writing Center in general, feel free to contact us at ccw@svsu.edu or the Director of the Center for Community Writing, Helen Reka Klotz, at klotz@svsu.edu.